The four of us, Eric, Mallory, James, and Sophie, had been planning this hiking trip for months. Pine Hollow National Park was our go-to spot for adventures, a sprawling wilderness that promised rugged trails and breathtaking views. This year, though, something felt different from the moment we arrived. The air was colder than expected for late autumn, the sky overcast with a gray pallor that seemed reluctant to lift. Even the usual chorus of birds and rustling leaves was absent, leaving an eerie stillness that set my teeth on edge. Our plan was simple: hike to the western ridge, camp for a night, and circle back down the mountain by sunset the next day. James, ever the meticulous planner, had the route mapped out in his GPS, though he carried a physical map for good measure. Mallory, the self-proclaimed daredevil of the group, was more interested in blazing her own trail. Sophie, quiet but sharp-eyed, brought up the rear, her camera swinging from her neck as she snapped photos of the towering pines. About 3 miles in, we came across a weathered wooden sign. Most of the letters were faded, but we could just make out Old Fire Lookout Tower, 2.5 miles, with an arrow pointing to a barely visible path. James frowned, consulting his map. This trail's not on here anymore. It must have been decommissioned years ago. Mallory's eyes lit up. Even better. Let's check it out. Sophie hesitated. If it's not on the map, maybe it's dangerous. That's the point, Mallory said, grinning. Come on. What's life without a little risk? After some back and forth, curiosity won out. We veered off the main trail, following the faint path. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches arching overhead like a canopy, blotting out what little light the sun offered. The air was colder here, damp with the smell of moss and decaying leaves. It wasn't long before we started noticing odd things. A rusted lantern hung from a low tree branch, swaying slightly in the breeze. Beneath it, the earth was disturbed, as if something had been buried there. Eric, always the jokester, grabbed a stick and began poking at the dirt. Leave it alone, Sophie said sharply. She was rarely so firm, and her tone made us all pause. It's probably just some old trash, Eric muttered, but he dropped the stick. We continued on, but the unease lingered. About half a mile later, Mallory spotted something unusual. A small, weathered cabin, half hidden behind a curtain of ivy. The windows were shattered, the door slightly ajar. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Should we check it out? Mallory asked, already making her way toward it. James hesitated. Maybe we shouldn't. It's probably not safe. Don't be such a wimp, she shot back, pushing the door open with a creak. The interior was even more unsettling. The air was thick with the smell of rot and mildew. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs clung to the corners. A broken chair lay on its side near a fireplace filled with ash. On a wooden desk against the far wall sat a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn. Mallory picked it up, flipping through the pages. Her expression shifted from curiosity to unease. You guys need to see this. The journal was filled with frantic, scrawled entries, some barely legible. Most were mundane observations about the forest, but as we read on, the tone grew darker, more erratic. There's something out here. I hear it at night, moving through the trees. It watches me. I can't leave. Every time I try, the forest pulls me back. It won't let me go. I've done terrible things, but it's not my fault. The forest makes me do them. We exchanged uneasy glances. This guy was clearly unwell, James said, closing the journal. Let's just go. As we turned to leave, Sophie froze. Wait, she whispered. Do you hear that? We all went still. At first, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing. Then, faintly, we heard it, a low, rhythmic creaking like the sound of wood swaying under weight. It was coming from outside. Eric peeked through the broken window, but saw nothing. Probably just the wind, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We left the cabin quickly, eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever had lived there. But the atmosphere in the forest had changed. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The farther we went, the harder it was to ignore the tension creeping into the group. We stuck close together, speaking in hushed tones as if the forest might overhear us. The trail became increasingly overgrown, forcing us to push through brambles and low-hanging branches. Twice, James stopped to consult his map and compass, but they were little help. The compass needle spun lazily, refusing to settle, and the map showed only blank spaces where the trail should have been. "It doesn't make sense," James muttered. "We should have hit the lookout tower by now." "It's not like the tower just disappeared," Eric said, trying to sound lighthearted. "Let's keep going." But each step felt heavier, like the forest itself was pressing down on us. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. Sophie lagged behind, snapping pictures with her camera, but she seemed more subdued than usual. "I don't like this place," she admitted when I fell back to walk with her. "Something about it feels wrong." I nodded, though I couldn't put my own unease into words. It wasn't just the silence or the strangeness of the trail. It was the way the shadows seemed to move at the edges of my vision, the way the trees leaned closer, their branches like grasping fingers. By late afternoon, we stumbled across a clearing. In the center was a massive tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled. Deep scratches marred the bark, claw marks gouged into the wood in irregular patterns. Mallory knelt to examine them, her brow furrowed. "Bear, maybe," she guessed, though she didn't sound convinced. "Whatever it was," Sophie said, "it had claws the size of steak knives." As if on cue, a branch snapped in the distance. We froze, straining to hear, but the sound didn't repeat. Mallory was the first to recover, forcing a laugh. "Relax. It's probably just an animal." "Yeah," Eric added, though his hand lingered near the hunting knife strapped to his belt. "Let's not freak ourselves out." But the cracks and rustling grew more frequent as we continued, always seeming to come from just beyond the edge of our vision. The sunlight was fading fast, and the thought of camping in this part of the forest was almost unbearable. Yet we had no choice. We wouldn't make it back to the main trail before nightfall. We found a relatively clear spot to set up camp, though it felt exposed. The trees surrounding us seemed impossibly tall, their tops disappearing into the growing darkness. As we pitched our tents, Sophie kept glancing over her shoulder, her fingers trembling as she worked. "I swear I saw something," she whispered to me as I helped her with the poles. "Something moved." "It's just your imagination," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. By the time we got a fire going, the darkness had swallowed the forest. The flames cast flickering shadows that danced and twisted like living things. No one had much appetite, but we forced down some protein bars and jerky in tense silence. James broke it first, pulling the journal from his pack. "Let's see if there's anything useful in here," he said, flipping to a random page. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, and the words sent a chill down my spine. "They come at night, shadows with no faces. I thought I could hide, but they always find me. The forest shows them the way." "Okay, that's enough," Sophie said, her voice shaking. "This whole trip was a bad idea." Mallory scoffed. "It's just a crazy guy's ramblings. There's nothing out there." But her bravado cracked when another noise echoed through the forest. A low, guttural groan that seemed to come from all around us. Eric jumped to his feet, shining his flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only endless rows of trunks and tangled undergrowth. "Probably an animal," he said, but his voice was tight. No one slept well that night. I kept my flashlight clutched in my hand, the journal tucked under my sleeping bag. Every time I started to drift off, a faint noise, like distant whispers, jolted me awake. Around midnight, Sophie screamed, sending all of us scrambling out of our tents. "What happened?" James demanded. "Something brushed against me," she stammered, her face pale. "I felt it cold and wet." Eric searched the area with his flashlight, but found nothing. "It's just your nerves," he said, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. We huddled close to the fire for the rest of the night, jumping at every sound. By dawn, the fire was reduced to embers, and we were all bleary-eyed and on edge. James tried the map again, but it was no help. "We need to find the main trail," he said. "No more detours." No one argued. As we packed up, Sophie let out a small gasp. She pointed to the ground near her tent, where a single footprint was pressed into the dirt. It was large, far larger than any human foot, and the toes ended in sharp, claw-like impressions. "We're leaving," Mallory said, her usual confidence replaced by fear. The forest didn't seem so silent anymore. As we set off, I swore I could hear faint laughter just beyond the edge of the trees. We walked in tense silence, the trail winding endlessly through the oppressive forest. James led the way, his eyes darting between the useless compass and the crumpled map in his hand. Mallory had taken a spot in the rear, her knife out now, glinting faintly in the weak sunlight that filtered through the canopy. Every so often, we would stop, our breath catching as distant sounds reached our ears. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, faint whispers that seemed to swirl on the edge of the breeze. Each time we turned to look, the forest stared back, unmoving, yet alive in its stillness. "Does it feel darker to anyone else?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. She clutched her camera tightly, as if it might somehow protect her. Eric nodded. "We're going downhill, right? Shouldn't it be getting lighter?" "It's the trees," James muttered. "They're thicker here, blocking the light." Even he didn't sound convinced. An hour later, the path opened into another clearing, and there it was, the fire lookout tower. The rusted structure loomed over us, its skeletal frame partially obscured by creeping vines. The stairs leading up were warped and unstable, many of the rungs missing entirely. "Finally," Mallory said, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. "A landmark. I don't think we should go up there," Sophie said. "It looks like it's ready to collapse." "Then we won't," James said. "But it's good to know we're somewhere that was on the map. Maybe we're closer to the main trail than we think." We approached cautiously, circling the base of the tower. It was clear no one had been here in decades. The wooden planks of the observation deck were rotted through, and the rusted metal groaned softly in the wind. Then Eric froze, pointing to a small structure at the base of the tower. It was a shed, its door hanging off its hinges. A faint, sour smell wafted out as we approached, growing stronger with each step. Inside, we found the remains of an old workstation, a rusted radio, scattered papers, and a long-dead lantern hanging from a nail. But it was what lay in the corner that made Sophie gasp and step back. Bones! Human bones. The skeleton was slumped against the wall, its hands still clutching a long-dead rifle. The tattered remains of a ranger's uniform clung to the bones, and a rusted nameplate was barely visible on the jacket, D. Cole. James swallowed hard. He must have been the ranger here. Maybe he got lost too, or he went insane, Mallory muttered, glancing nervously at the bones. Eric rifled through the scattered papers, pulling out a weathered notebook. "It's a logbook," he said, flipping through it. Looks like he was keeping track of hikers. "Wait." His voice trailed off as he stared at the last few entries. He read them aloud. October 14th. Heard voices again last night. Tried the radio, still nothing. I think they're getting closer. October 16th. Found tracks by the cabin. Not human. They're watching me. Always watching. October 19th. I made a mistake. They won't let me leave. This forest, it's alive. It knows. A loud crack outside made us all jump. Eric dropped the notebook, and we scrambled out of the shed, scanning the tree line. The forest seemed unchanged, but the air was electric with tension. Every shadow seemed deeper, every branch a claw. "Something's out there," Sophie whispered, her face pale. "It's just the wind," James said, though his hand was trembling as he folded the map. "Let's move." We left the clearing quickly, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The whispers returned, faint and disjointed, like a conversation we weren't meant to hear. Once, Mallory spun around, her knife raised, but there was nothing there. By late afternoon, we came across another oddity, a circle of stones, overgrown with moss. In the center was a charred patch of earth, as if a fire had burned there long ago. Around the edge of the circle were crude carvings in the rocks, symbols we didn't recognize, jagged and chaotic. "This feels bad," Sophie said, taking a step back. James crouched to examine one of the carvings, his brow furrowed. They look recent, like someone's been here. Someone or something, Eric said. That was when we saw the first sign of blood. A streak of dark red marred the ground near the edge of the clearing, leading deeper into the trees. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Mallory knelt beside it, her jaw tightening. "We're not alone out here," she said grimly. "We need to get out of these woods. Now!" But the forest wasn't ready to let us go. As we followed the faint trail, the trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches intertwining above us like a cage. The ground was uneven, littered with roots that seemed to reach out to trip us. And all the while, the whispers grew louder. Then we saw it, a figure standing in the distance. It was tall and gaunt, its body barely more than a shadow. For a moment, it seemed to meet our eyes, its hollow gaze piercing. Then it melted into the trees. Mallory swore under her breath. "Tell me you saw that." No one answered. We were too terrified to speak. We moved faster, tripping over roots and ducking under low-hanging branches as we followed the faint blood trail. The whispers were no longer distant. They were all around us, threading through the trees like an invisible web. They weren't just voices either. There were soft footfalls, rustling leaves, and the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping underfoot. But no matter how hard we looked, we couldn't see who or what was out there. "Stop," Sophie hissed, grabbing my arm. "Do you hear it?" We all froze. The whisper stopped, replaced by a heavy, rhythmic sound, breathing. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. My skin prickled as I scanned the forest, but there was nothing. Just endless trees and shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. "Let's keep moving," James whispered. His voice trembled, the calm leader facade finally cracking. We stumbled into another clearing just as the last rays of sunlight bled out of the sky. In the center was a mound of rocks, arranged haphazardly, but unmistakably meant to mark something. Sophie approached hesitantly, her flashlight illuminating a faint engraving on the largest stone. "What does it say?" Eric asked. "It's not English," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it feels like a warning." James knelt beside the mound, brushing away moss. His fingers froze as he uncovered something metallic, a rusted blade, its handle wrapped in rotting leather. Beside it lay a ring, tarnished and warped. Sophie shined her flashlight on the ring, and we saw the initials etched into its surface, DC. "Derek Cole," James said. "The Ranger." Eric stepped back, his face pale. "We're standing on his grave." A loud crack echoed from the trees, like a branch snapping under weight. Then another, and another. They were getting closer. "We need to go," Mallory said, her voice urgent. She turned and bolted into the trees, and the rest of us had no choice but to follow. The forest swallowed us whole. Night had fallen completely, and the canopy was so dense that even the stars were invisible. Our flashlights cast weak, flickering beams that barely penetrated the darkness. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a threat. "Wait," Sophie panted, stopping suddenly. "Where's James?" We turned, our beams cutting through the void, but he was gone. "James!" I yelled, my voice breaking. The echoes bounced back at me, distorted and hollow. "We have to go back," Sophie said, tears streaming down her face. Mallory shook her head. "If we go back, we'll get lost, or worse. We can't just leave him." Sophie snapped. Another sound stopped our argument cold. A guttural, wet growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. It was followed by a low, rumbling laugh, faint but unmistakable. My heart pounded as I turned my flashlight toward the source. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A face, pale and gaunt, its eyes empty sockets. Then it was gone. "Run," Mallory whispered. "Now!" We ran blindly, crashing through the undergrowth. Branches tore at our clothes and scratched our skin, but we didn't stop. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trees closing in, funneling us in directions we didn't want to go. I lost count of how many times I stumbled, my hands scraping against the cold, damp earth as I pushed myself up again. Sophie was ahead of me, her flashlight swinging wildly. "This way," she yelled, though she had no idea where she was going. Eric pulled up beside me, his face a mask of fear. "We're going in circles," he gasped. "I swear I saw that tree earlier." He was right. The forest was playing tricks on us. The same twisted tree with the deep claw marks appeared over and over, no matter which way we ran. When we stopped to catch our breath, I realized Sophie was gone. I spun in a circle, shining my light into the darkness. "Sophie!" I screamed. No answer, just silence. Mallory grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't yell. It'll hear you." "What will?" I asked, but I didn't need an answer. The growl returned, louder this time, reverberating through my chest. It was followed by heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer and closer. Mallory pulled me behind a tree, her breathing ragged. "Stay quiet," she whispered. Eric crouched nearby, his flashlight off. The darkness was suffocating, but we didn't dare make a sound. The footsteps stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears. Then, faintly, I heard it, a voice, low and raspy, calling my name. "Eric," it crooned. "Mallory, come out, come out." My stomach turned. It wasn't just calling our names. It was mimicking James's voice. Eric's hand tightened around his flashlight. He mouthed the words, "Don't move." The voice grew louder, more insistent. "You can't hide," it said, the tone almost playful. "I see you." A shadow passed just a few feet away, tall and impossibly thin. Its head turned, scanning the trees. I held my breath, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but I didn't dare. Then it was gone. We stayed frozen for what felt like hours before Mallory finally whispered, "We have to move." Eric nodded. "We need to find Sophie. And James." But as we crept through the forest, it became clear that we weren't alone. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more distinct. They weren't just random murmurs anymore. They were words. And they were angry. "You'll never leave," one voice hissed. "Stay with us," another pleaded. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my spare batteries, but Mallory grabbed my arm. "Don't bother," she said. "They don't want us to see." That was when I heard Sophie scream. Sophie's scream echoed through the forest, sharp and piercing. It was coming from somewhere ahead, but the sound ricocheted off the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint her exact location. Mallory took off in a sprint, her flashlight bouncing wildly, and I followed close behind. Eric hesitated, but reluctantly brought up the rear, muttering curses under his breath. We burst into another clearing, our breaths ragged. Sophie wasn't there, but something else was. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk blackened and twisted like a grotesque wound in the earth. Hanging from its branches were dozens of objects, rusted tools, scraps of cloth, even animal skulls. And carved deep into its bark was a single word, repeated over and over, "Stay." "What the hell is this?" Mallory whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. The air around us felt heavy, pressing down on my chest like a weight. Then, from the shadows, Sophie stumbled into the clearing. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her clothes were torn, and her hands were streaked with blood. "We have to leave," she gasped. "It's coming." "What's coming?" Eric demanded, grabbing her shoulders. "Where's James?" "I don't know," she cried, tears streaming down her face. It took and pulled him into the trees. I couldn't stop it. The ground beneath us suddenly trembled, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The tree's branches swayed violently, though there was no wind. Sophie shrieked, pointing at something behind us. We turned as one, and there it was. The figure from before stepped into the clearing, its gaunt frame illuminated by the faint glow of our flashlights. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend like twisted branches. Its face was a hollow void, two empty sockets where its eyes should have been. But the worst part was its hands. Long, spindly fingers tipped with claws that glistened with something dark and wet. Eric raised his flashlight, the beam trembling. "Stay back," he yelled. The creature tilted its head, as if studying him. Then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "You should not have come here." The words sent a chill down my spine. I tried to back away, but my legs felt like lead. The creature took a step forward, and the ground shuddered beneath its feet. "Run!" Mallory screamed, shoving Sophie toward the trees. We bolted, tearing through the forest with no sense of direction. The whispers followed us, louder and more frenzied, mingling with the sound of the creature's pursuit. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. Its presence seemed to warp the forest itself, closing the trees around us and forcing us into a labyrinth of gnarled roots and choking vines. We finally broke through into another clearing, gasping for air. This one was smaller, dominated by a large, moss-covered cairn in the center. Something about it felt familiar, and then it hit me. This was the same cairn we'd seen earlier, the one marking Derek Cole's grave. We'd gone in a complete circle. Mallory dropped to her knees, her flashlight beam sweeping over the rocks. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "It's not possible." "It's the forest," Sophie said, her voice barely audible. "It's alive. It's keeping us here." "No," Eric said, shaking his head. "No, we can't be trapped. There's got to be a way out." I wasn't listening. My eyes were fixed on the cairn, on the rusted blade, and the tarnished ring lying atop it. Slowly, almost involuntarily, I reached out to touch the knife. The moment my fingers brushed the metal, a voice echoed in my mind, cold and hollow, like the wind through a crypt. "You found me." The forest seemed to shift around us, the air growing colder. Shadows gathered at the edges of the clearing, taking on strange, twisted forms. The whispers became screams, and I realized they weren't coming from the forest. They were coming from within me. Mallory grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Don't touch it," she shouted. But it was too late. The cairn trembled, the rocks shifting and collapsing inward. From the center of the mound, something emerged, a skeletal hand, its bones blackened and slick with decay. A figure pulled itself free, piece by piece, until it stood before us. It was Derek Cole, or what was left of him. His hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light, and his rotting flesh seemed to writhe and pulse, as if something beneath the surface was trying to escape. "You cannot leave," he rasped, his voice blending with the wind. "The forest remembers. The forest keeps." We backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows had closed in completely, forming a wall of impenetrable darkness. "What do you want from us?" Sophie sobbed. Derek tilted his head, his gaze settling on me. "Stay," he said. "Stay with us." The last thing I remember was the ground collapsing beneath my feet, the world spinning as I fell into darkness. When I woke, it was dawn. The forest was silent, the clearing empty. Mallory, Sophie, and Eric lay nearby, unconscious but alive. The cairn was gone. So was Derek. We stumbled back to the main trail, our silence heavy with unspoken fear. When we finally reached the ranger station, we told him everything. The ranger listened, his face growing pale as we described the cairn and the creature. "You found Derek Cole," he said finally. "He disappeared 30 years ago. People say he went mad, killed hikers before vanishing into the forest. But we saw him," Mallory insisted. "He's still out there." The ranger shook his head. "No one's been out there in decades. That part of the forest, it's not on any maps anymore. We left Pine Hollow that day and never looked back. But sometimes in the dead of night, I hear the whispers again. The forest calling, the forest remembering. And I know it's only a matter of time before it calls me back."